She would spend the rest of her life trying to explain why she kissed a stranger in the dark, and she would never manage to make it sound like anything other than the truth, which was this. The lights went out. The music stopped. Somebody laughed nearby like it was part of the show, and a hand found her waist before she could step back. She did not scream. She did not pull away. She tilted her chin up into the black and let a man she could not see kiss her like he already knew the shape of her mouth, and for 11 seconds, Wren Calloway forgot every rule she had ever made for herself. Then the generators kicked back on. The chandeliers of the old harbor exchange blazed gold again, and the stranger was gone before her eyes adjusted, leaving her standing alone at the edge of the dance floor with her lipstick smudged and her pulse still slamming against her ribs like it was trying to get out. She told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself a great many things that year that turned out not to be true. 6 weeks earlier, nobody in this city would have looked at Wren twice. That was, in fact, the entire point of her life. She worked in a narrow office above the Harbor Authority building with water-stained charts on the walls, translating shipping manifests from 4 languages into the one the customs officers actually read, and she was very good at being forgettable, good at blending into a room, good at listening while people assumed she wasn't. She had built that skill on purpose, in another life, in a uniform nobody in this city knew she used to wear, and she had buried it so deep that even her own reflection sometimes struggled to find it. Nobody knew that before she translated bills of lading for a living, Wren Calloway had spent 3 years reading intercepted cargo communications for a maritime intelligence unit, hunting for the small inconsistencies that meant a container was carrying something other than what its paperwork claimed. Nobody knew she still saw those inconsistencies everywhere, like a language she couldn't stop hearing, even after she'd sworn to never speak it again. She had walked away from that work for reasons she did not examine on purpose, and she had built herself a small, quiet, invisible life on the docks of a city that ran, whether anyone said it aloud or not, on the goodwill of one family. The Dre family did not need to announce themselves. Everyone on the waterfront already knew the compass on the black iron gate at the end of Founders Pier belonged to them, and everyone knew what it meant when a ship flying under Dre protection was never once stopped, never once searched, never once delayed by a storm of paperwork that sank every other company's cargo for a week at a time. They called the man who ran it many things behind closed doors, the ghost of the harbor, the man who never raised his voice and never needed to, the reason 3 rival importers had quietly closed their offices in the last 2 years without a single visible cause. His name was Caspian Dre, and Wren had seen his face exactly twice in 6 years, both times in photographs, both times at a distance that told her everything about how carefully he was kept from being photographed at all. She had not expected to ever stand close enough to know what he smelled like. She had certainly not expected to kiss him in the dark at a blackout charity gala for dock workers' families, thinking he was some anonymous shipping executive with good hands and better instincts, only to watch, 3 days later, security footage of the very same masquerade circulate quietly through the Harbor Authority's private channels, footage that showed, in grainy infrared before the cameras died with the power, a tall man in a dark coat crossing the floor toward a woman in green, moving with the unmistakable, unhurried certainty of someone who had never once been told no in his life. She recognized the coat before she recognized anything else. She recognized the way he moved like water, finding the lowest point in a room, like violence that had simply decided, for now, to be still. She had gone to the masquerade that night for the same reason she went to most things, because it was expected, because the Harbor Authority always sent a translator to the dock workers' charity gala in case a foreign shipping delegate needed help with a toast, and because staying home alone in her apartment above the chandlery had started to feel less like solitude and more like slowly being erased. She had worn green because green was the color she wore when she wanted, for one single night, to be looked at rather than overlooked, and she had told herself that was the only reason, and she had almost believed it until the moment the lights went out and a hand found her waist in the dark, like it had been waiting there her whole life to arrive. She did not know, standing at the edge of that dance floor with her heartbeat still climbing, that the man behind her had crossed an entire crowded room in total darkness, without hesitating once, the way a man moves only when he has already memorized the exact geometry of every space he intends to occupy. She did not know that he had noticed her 3 full minutes before the power failed, noticed the particular way she held herself apart from a crowd without ever looking lonely, noticed the stillness in her that most people mistook for shyness, and that he, immediately, recognized as something closer to discipline. She would learn all of that later, in pieces, the way you learn the shape of a storm only after it has already reorganized the coastline. Before we go any further into how deep this went, if you're the kind of listener who lives for dark, slow-burning stories about power, obsession, and the kind of man who ruins a woman's peace just by looking at her twice, go ahead and hit that like button now and subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories, because Wren Calloway had no idea, not yet, just how completely her life was about to belong to somebody else. And I want to know, when you're done listening, would you have run from a man like Caspian Dre, or would you have stayed to find out what he wanted? She did not go looking for him. That was the truth she clung to later, when everything had already burned down around her. She was called to Founders Pier on a Tuesday morning by a harbor authority supervisor, who told her, in a voice too careful to be casual, that the Dre Maritime Syndicate had requested a private translator for an internal audit. Someone with clearance, someone who could be trusted not to talk. Wren's name had apparently come up. She did not ask who had put it there. She should have. The compass gate opened for her, without a guard so much as glancing at her identification twice, which told her more about the family's reach than any rumor ever had. Inside, the estate did not look like money trying to announce itself. It looked like money that had stopped needing to. Dark wood, low light, a house built by people who understood that true power rarely needs witnesses. She was led to a study that smelled of rain and cedar, and she was 3 sentences into introducing herself to the room before the man behind the desk lifted his head, and she stopped speaking entirely because she knew that jaw. She knew the particular stillness of those shoulders. She knew, with a lurch that dropped straight through her stomach, exactly whose mouth she had memorized in the dark 2 weeks earlier. Caspian Dre did not smile. He did not gloat or smirk or do any of the small performative things a lesser man might have done to let her know that he, too, remembered. He simply watched her for a long moment with eyes the color of harbor water at dusk, gray-green and unreadable, and said, in a voice pitched low enough that she felt it in her chest before she processed the words, "You left before I could ask your name. You didn't exactly introduce yourself either," she said, and hated how steady her own voice sounded, when nothing else in her was steady at all. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He gestured to the chair across from him, as though the last 2 weeks had not happened, as though her pulse were not currently trying to climb out through her throat. "Sit down, Miss Calloway. I have a problem, and I'm told you're the only person in this city who can read what I need. Read, without asking questions I don't want asked." The problem, it turned out, was simple to describe and impossible to look at directly. 3 shipments in 4 months had crossed the harbor under Dre protection and arrived at their destination short, not stolen outright, Nothing so clumsy as that. But reduced. A few crates here, a container's worth of goods there, always within a margin small enough to be written off as spoilage or miscount by anyone who wasn't looking closely. Caspian Dre was looking closely. He had been looking closely for months, quietly, without telling the one man whose job it technically was to notice such things. His cousin and second-in-command, Ellis Marrow, the man who had run the syndicate's shipping logistics since before Caspian had taken over the family from his father. The man everyone assumed would one day either succeed him or die trying. Wren did not ask why he had come to a stranger from the harbor authority instead of trusting his own people. She understood the moment she saw the paperwork spread across his desk. Exactly why. The manifests were clean, too clean. The kind of clean that took real skill to produce, the kind of falsification you didn't stumble into by accident. And skill like that, in an organization this size, narrowed the list of people capable of it down to a number small enough to be almost unbearable. She spent 4 hours that first day, with her head bent over shipping documents, while Caspian Dre sat across the room pretending to read something else, and she felt the weight of his attention the entire time, like a hand resting, unmoving, at the base of her spine. She did not tell him, yet, what she was starting to see in the numbers. She was not ready to say the name that kept surfacing in her mind every time she cross-referenced dates against a set of internal transfer logs that Ellis Marrow, and only Ellis Marrow, had access to sign off on. "You're good at this," Caspian said finally, when the light outside had gone the deep blue of early evening, and she had not spoken in over an hour. "Better than good. Where does a translator learn to read a falsified bill of lading like she's hunting something alive inside it?" "Everyone has a past they don't put on a resume," Wren said, not looking up. "I noticed," he said, and something in his tone made her glance at him despite herself, and found him already watching her with an expression that was not quite suspicion, and not quite anything as simple as desire, but some third thing, older and more dangerous than either. The look of a man recalculating exactly how much a person in front of him might be worth to keep close. She should have been afraid of that look. She told herself later that she had been. She was aware, in the same breath, that fear was not actually the sensation currently pooling low and warm in her stomach, and that terrified her far more than anything Caspian Dre had said. Over the following 2 weeks, the audit became a reason to see him almost daily, and the reason stopped, slowly, and then all at once, being about the audit at all. He was not what 6 years of rumor had prepared her for. The ghost of the harbor did not raise his voice because he had never needed to. Men who worked for him for a decade still flinched at a certain quality of silence he could produce simply by setting down a pen. But with her, in the low lamplight of that study, he was something closer to patient. He asked her questions about the languages she spoke, and actually listened to the answers. He noticed, without her saying anything, that she took her coffee black and unsweetened, and simply began having it ready when she arrived. He was, she began to realize with something like dread, a man who paid the kind of attention most people only pretended to pay, and being seen that clearly by someone that dangerous was its own particular kind of undoing. "You watch me like you're deciding something," she said to him one night, when the audit had officially ended 2 days earlier, and she had, unofficially, kept coming back anyway, and neither of them had said, "Why out loud?" "I am," he said simply. "I'm deciding whether I can afford to want you as much as I currently do." The words landed in her chest like a struck bell, and she did not have an answer for them, because the honest one, that she wanted to be afforded, that she had spent 6 years building a life small enough that no one could ever again make her feel the way he made her feel, in half a sentence, was not something she was prepared to say out loud to a man who controlled every ship that moved through this harbor, and by extension, every life again on the third night after the audit officially ended, in full light this time, both of them fully aware of exactly who was in the room, and it was nothing like the blackout at the harbor exchange. That kiss had been curiosity and instinct and the anonymous freedom of the dark. This one was a claim. His hand came up to cradle her jaw, like she was something rare he had been waiting a long time to be allowed to hold. And when he finally drew back, he rested his forehead against hers and said, "Lo, I don't do this. I don't let people close enough to matter. You should know that before you decide whether to run." "I'm not running," she said, and meant it, and did not yet understand what that promise was going to cost her. It cost her 3 weeks later, on the night Ellis Marrow smiled at her across a dinner table, with an ease that should have warned her sooner, and asked, in a voice pitched casually enough to seem like nothing at all, exactly how she had gotten so skilled at reading falsified manifests for a harbor translator who supposedly had no background beyond 4 languages and a quiet office. Wren felt the floor of the conversation shift under her before she understood why, and she answered carefully, vaguely, the way she had trained herself to answer that exact question for 6 years, and watched Ellis Marrow's smile widen by half an inch, the smile of a man who had just confirmed something he had only suspected before. She noticed the car the following evening, parked half a block from her apartment above the chandlery, its engine idling with the particular patience of someone who was not waiting for anyone in particular, only watching. She noticed it again 2 nights later, outside the small grocery where she bought her coffee, and again on the morning she walked to the Harbor Authority office, always at a distance calculated to seem accidental, always gone by the time she thought to look twice. 6 years of training she had tried to forget came back to her all at once, cold and precise. You do not confront a tale. You do not let it know you have made it. You change your route, you vary your timing, and you tell exactly one person, the person who can actually do something about it. She told Caspian, and watched something in his face close like a door being locked from the inside. He asked no questions about how she had recognized the surveillance so quickly, though she could see the question sitting behind his eyes, patient, filed away for later. He simply said, "From now on, you don't walk anywhere in this city alone." And when she opened her mouth to argue that she had survived perfectly well alone for 6 years before he had ever kissed her in the dark, he crossed the room and took her face in both hands and said, "Lo, I'm not asking you, Wren. I am telling you, because if Ellis has decided you're worth watching, it means Ellis has already decided you're a problem, and I have buried men for smaller offenses than being a problem to this family." It was the first time he had said Ellis's name to her, with anything other than the easy affection of a man speaking about a cousin he had grown up beside, and the shift in his voice told her, more clearly than any evidence yet could, that some part of him had already begun to suspect what she was still working up the courage to confirm. She told Caspian that night what she had found, buried in the transfer logs 3 weeks earlier, and had been too afraid, or too unwilling, to say out loud until then. That every discrepancy traced back to authorizations only one signature could produce. That the falsifications were skilled enough to have been built by someone trained in exactly the kind of documentation work she herself had once done for the government. That Ellis Marrow was not simply skimming from his cousin's shipments out of greed, but funneling those goods, carefully and consistently, to a rival syndicate that had been trying to break Dre control of the harbor for over a decade. A syndicate, she was almost certain, that had first approached Ellis not with money, but with something worse, evidence of an old debt Caspian's late father had once owed and never repaid. Evidence that could be used to unravel the entire family's legitimacy in this city, if it ever surfaced. Caspian did not raise his voice. He went very, very still instead. The stillness she now understood was the truest warning sign in the entire syndicate, more dangerous by far than shouting, and he said only, "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, she said, and did not look away from him, even though every instinct told her to. 3 weeks, he repeated, quiet, almost gentle, which frightened her more than anger would have. "And you were going to tell me when?" "When I was certain," she said. "Because if I was wrong, I was about to accuse the second most powerful man in your organization of betraying you. And if I was right, if you were right," he said, "you were about to become the single most dangerous witness in this city, and Ellis would have every reason in the world to make sure you never testified to anything again." The next 4 days moved faster than Wren had ever experienced anything move in her life. Caspian did not confront Ellis directly. Could not. Not yet. Not without proof solid enough to survive the inevitable war that would follow an accusation this size inside a family this old. Instead, he asked Wren to do the one thing she had promised herself, walking away from her old intelligence work 6 years earlier, that she would never do again. Go back into the language of falsified documents, deep enough this time, to trace not just the pattern of the theft, but the digital fingerprints of exactly who had built it. Deep enough to hand Caspian something that could not be argued with, denied, or buried. She said yes before she had fully decided to. She said yes because somewhere in the last 6 weeks, without entirely meaning to, she had stopped being a woman hiding from her own competence and started being a woman who understood, finally, what it might mean to use it for someone worth protecting. She brought it to Caspian at 2 in the morning, exhausted, ink-stained, half convinced she had made a mistake that would get them both killed, and found him waiting for her in the same study where he had first asked her to sit down weeks earlier, and when she set the folder down in front of him and said, "It's him. It was always him." Caspian Dre looked at the proof of his cousin's betrayal for a long, silent moment, and then looked up at her instead, and the expression on his face was not triumph, and it was not even relief. It was something closer to grief, the specific grief of a man who had just watched the last piece of his father's world confirmed as rotten, and beneath that grief, something else entirely. A fierce, unhidden gratitude aimed directly at her, at the woman who had walked willingly back into the exact skill she had buried herself alive to escape, because she had decided, somewhere along the way, that he was worth the risk of becoming visible again. She did not expect Ellis Marrow to find her alone, but she should have. He came to her the following afternoon, at the Harbor Authority office, of all places, stepping through her door with the same easy smile he had worn across the dinner table weeks earlier, and closed it quietly behind him before she had even fully risen from her chair. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the files still spread across her desk, before she could think to cover them. Caspian doesn't usually let outsiders this close to family business. "I confess, I underestimated you, Miss Calloway. I assumed you were exactly what your file said. A translator. Forgettable." His smile did not waver, but something underneath it had gone very cold. "It's a rare skill, disappearing that thoroughly. I would know. I've spent 4 months disappearing an entire shipping operation right under my cousin's nose, and it took him this long to even think to look." "He knows," Wren said, keeping her voice level, though her pulse had begun to hammer. "It's already done, Ellis. Whatever you're here to do to me won't undo the paper trail." "No," he agreed, almost pleasant about it. "But it might buy me the time to disappear the way you once did, and I find I'm rather more interested in that outcome than in what happens to you." He took one unhurried step toward her desk, and Wren's hand found, without conscious thought, the brass letter opener resting among her papers. A small, useless thing against a man his size, but a thing nonetheless, and 6 years of training reminded her in that instant that even a useless thing, wielded without hesitation, could buy 3 seconds, and 3 seconds was sometimes the entire distance between surviving a room and not. She never had to find out whether she would have needed it. The door opened behind Ellis without a knock, and Caspian Dre filled the frame with a stillness so absolute that the temperature of the room seemed to drop around it. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He said only, "Step away from her," in a tone Wren had never once heard him use, not even in the worst of the last 4 weeks. And Ellis Marrow, to his credit, did not pretend not to understand exactly what was happening. "Caspian," Ellis started. "I have known you since we were boys," Caspian said, crossing the room slowly, each step unhurried, each step somehow louder than shouting. "I have covered for your temper, your debts, your father's mistakes, and mine. And I would have kept covering for you until one of us died, because that is what family is supposed to mean. But you put a man outside her apartment. You let yourself into her office alone. Whatever quarrel you have with me, Ellis, you brought it to her door, and that is the one thing I was never going to allow you to survive." What happened to Ellis Marrow in the following 48 hours was not something Wren witnessed directly, and Caspian never described it to her in detail, only told her, quietly, the night it was finished, that the harbor was safe now, that the rival syndicate's foothold had been cut off at the root, and that no one, ever again, would question whose family controlled these docks. She understood, without needing it spelled out, exactly what that sentence contained, and exactly what it had cost him to say it about his own blood, and she did not ask for more than he offered, because some kinds of mercy in a world like his were simply not available to be given. What she did ask for, 3 nights later, standing in the same study where this had all begun, was whether he still intended to let her walk back out through that compass gate and disappear into her small, forgettable life, the way she had planned to disappear the morning after the masquerade, before any of this had happened. Caspian crossed the room slowly, the same unhurried certainty he moved with when he had first found her in the dark, and framed her face in both hands like he was memorizing it against some future, when he might not be allowed to. "I told you once I don't let people close enough to matter," he said. "I lied. You've mattered since the moment you tilted your chin up in that blackout, and let a stranger kiss you like he had every right to. I am not letting you disappear, Rand Calloway. Not from this harbor. Not from this house. Not from me." "That sounds like a threat," she said, and her voice shook only a little. "It's a promise," he said, "which, where I come from, is considerably more binding." And then he kissed her again, in full light, in front of no one but the two of them and the compass on his desk that had once belonged to his father, and this time neither of them pulled away when it ended. Later, when the harbor had gone quiet outside the study windows, and the last of the year's storms had finally passed over the city, Wren stood at the glass, looking down at Founders Pier, at the black iron gate and the ships beyond, it moving in and out under a protection that had, for the first time in months, stopped feeling fragile. She thought of the woman she had been 6 weeks earlier, the one who had built an entire life out of being overlooked, who had believed, quietly and completely, that safety and invisibility were the same thing. She did not recognize that woman anymore, not entirely, and she found she did not miss her. Caspian came to stand behind her, his hands settling at her waist, the same way they had in the dark at the masquerade, Except now there was nothing anonymous about it. Nothing hidden. Nothing either of them needed to pretend not to know. "Regrets?" he asked quietly against her hair. "None," she said, and meant it more fully than she had meant almost anything in her life. "Though I imagine my old supervisors would have several opinions about a former intelligence analyst falling for the most feared man on the entire waterfront." "Let them have opinions," Caspian said. "I intend to keep you regardless." He turned her gently to face him, and in the low lamplight, his eyes had lost the guarded distance she remembered from that first afternoon in this same room, replaced now by something unguarded and entirely hers. "You walked back into the exact life you buried yourself to escape, for me. I don't know how a man is supposed to deserve that. I only know I don't intend to waste it." "Then don't," she said simply, and rose to meet him. And this time, when he kissed her, there was no blackout to blame it on, no stranger's anonymity to hide behind, only the two of them, fully known to each other at last, and the quiet, certain understanding that neither of them was going anywhere. If you were captivated by Wren's hidden strength and Caspian's dark, unshakable obsession, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Wren's shoes? Walked away the morning after the blackout? Or stayed to find out exactly what kind of man you had kissed in the dark? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.